to offer you this lesson from Unity of the Keys Spiritual Center.
America. How many of you have visited our national parks? America is a land of breathtaking landscapes and many diverse people. Our national parks have always called us to mystical, pristine nature. Those of you that have traveled to the summits of the Rockies or the dramatic giant rock sculptures of Moab, Utah, or the waterfalls of Yosemite, or the unfathomable overlook at the depths of the Grand Canyon, truly know the beauty of this country. It's in your cells. It takes our breath away, as well as inspires us, and it heals us. There's much evidence, although we don't really need the scientific proof, do we? But there is so much evidence that just being in nature is healing. There's also a lot of evidence that being in nature helps us to expand our consciousness and to think in terms of more abstract and mature, emotional, as well as spiritual thought forms. Isn't that amazing? There's actually a body of information that shows that there are only a few ways to help people get into formal operations, which means the ability to hold two simultaneous truths at the same time, right? To get beyond black and white thinking, linear thinking, into abstract modes of thinking that are required for people who are emotionally mature, mentally adult. And one of those ways is simply being in nature. Another way is movement. Actually, endurance athletics helps people to do that. It shifts their brain. It releases certain kinds of biochemical experiences that cause synergy of the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And meditation does it too. People come from all over the world to see the beauty in this country. And I'm really grateful. Growing up in New York State, I learned about the Hudson River School. How many of you know about the Hudson River School artists? The Hudson River School artists were instrumental in showing Congress that the magnificence of the beauty of nature was worth saving. Because the congressmen and the senators and the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers might not have gotten out hiking to what is now Taconic State Park or Treman Park, but when they saw the paintings, when the artists testified on their behalf, they made law enacted to save that land for all posterity. In fact, you may be surprised to know this in our polarized country politically, but it was the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers and the Hudson River School artists, many of them Republican, who fought the hardest for conservation in my home state. John Muir, how many of you have ever hiked the John Muir Trail? Yeah. Have you hiked them in Scotland too? So there's John Muir Trails in our country and there's John Muir Trails in Scotland. And I'm happy to say I love them both. In March 1868, John Muir arrived in San Francisco to visit Yosemite, a place that he'd only read about. And seeing it for the first time, he was so overwhelmed by the landscape that he scrambled down the steep cliffs to get a closer look at the waterfalls and was hooping and howling at the vistas. And he jumped tirelessly, smelling flower and flower. And he said this in his journal that night: "We are now in the mountains, and they are in us, kindling enthusiasm, making every nerve quiver, filling every pore and cell of us. No temple made with hands can compare with Yosemite, the grandest of all God's temples of nature." Who knew that what Muir said was actually true? He was a physicist, right, in description, because it is true that every cell and every atom of our body is being exchanged with the mountains, with the trees. There's in Japan a special school of the forest bathing school, where they've actually been doing a lot of research about how taking people into the forest when they're sick and then taking them out of the forest and testing them again, that it actually boosts their immune system and changes them in a beneficial way for their overall good health. It's true. Emerson went to visit John Muir at Yosemite, and it was said of John Muir, actually, that he usually spent his evening sitting by the campfire in his overcoat reading Emerson under the stars. And that really Emerson was the philosopher and the spiritual teacher, like our co-founders. Our co-founders also, named their children after Ralph Waldo Emerson. And we're very fond of him. That it was for him, John Muir, one of the ultimate epiphanies to share Yosemite with his teacher, Emerson. How many of you know about the last talk Emerson ever gave at Harvard? He was never invited back. Anybody? It's important to us in Unity because his last talk at Harvard Divinity School was to tell the truth about his radical ideas about God within us and all around us, and that there was no need for apostolic or priestly approval. He was a minister himself, and he was never invited back to Harvard Divinity School and ultimately stepped down from his ministry. But when Muir met Emerson, he wrote that night in his journal, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds blow their freshness into you. The storms, they give you their energy, while cares simply drop off your shoulders like autumn leaves." Our ancestors and immigrants today continue to come to our land and seas to seek a new life, to have liberty and safe shelter and the happiness they have not yet found. They come to America to enjoy certain freedoms, like the right to say what one thinks and believe what one chooses. From free speech to demonstrating on the White House lawn. We, the citizens of this country, have a right to speak up when we don't like what's going on with our government, with our town, with our land. And we do. We disagree. Although maybe lately, I find that people are becoming a bit too polite for my own personal taste. Recently, my friend Amy was visiting, and she was shocked that I asked a table of people from Washington, D.C., how it was going for them living in our nation's capital during this time. And the children rolled their eyes as the parents said, "We don't ever discuss politics with anyone. It isn't worth the energy." And as the kids continued to roll their eyes, I winked at them and I said, "It's important to them." I grew up in a family where it was okay to disagree. My dad was a Republican. My sister in college became a Democrat. I was not choosing. At 5, I was the youngest in my family and thought the whole thing was pretty silly. But we sat in a circle in my family, 5 kids, 2 adults, and whoever happened to be there, and we were allowed to say whatever we thought, and everyone else had to listen. It was called a family meeting, and I hated them. Especially when I was in middle school, when I was spouting all kinds of revolutionary ideas, like that girls should be allowed to wear pants to school, and that there really shouldn't be separate education for girls and boys. And to the absolute amazement of my father, one day he said, I've told many people this because it just made me laugh out loud, "I have raised you to be an independent thinker, but I just wish that you would only think independently about those things I want you to think about." He laughed too. I think it's important to teach our kids about the blind men and the elephant. How many of you know that story? It was taught to me when I was about 10, and it really stuck with me. It's about blind men holding onto an elephant, and then describing their experience. One's holding onto a tail, and they're describing what's true, and one's holding onto a trunk, and they're describing what's true, and one's got their hand on the back, and they're describing what's true, and one's holding onto a foot, and it's all true, but it's not the whole elephant. We are still a fairly young country. And even though we try so hard to do good, when we try so hard to get it right, we often fall short of our ideals. We do have this slight tendency towards arrogance and meddling in the affairs of others, and a hidden motive maybe for greed and control, guised in something else. But building a free society, this experiment we call America, is messy and has never been done before. Just like building a church, it has people in it, right? Diverse people who have their own agendas and who can think one thing one minute and think something the next minute and completely change. And we can be fooled sometimes by what the outer appearance is. How many of you have ever heard the name Bartolomé de las Casas? Not a single person? My guess is he's not in our history books. In 1513, he was the chaplain to the Spanish expedition that conquered Cuba. But that is not why I know his name. I know his name because one of my Benedictine teachers, Sister Joan Chittister, calls him a saint. Sister Joan Chittister and her very feisty, very incredible nuns wrote a book where they decided that the way that the church was canonizing saints was no longer fitting for them. And so they chose their own book of saints. And Las Casas was a linguist and a translator, and much later became a priest. But he is the chief source of information that we have about what happened after Columbus came to the shores of the Americas and to the islands. Las Casas witnessed Christopher Columbus and his men enslave and kill hundreds and thousands of Indians, not only in America, but also in the Bahamas and Cuba. And he decided Columbus was not civilized enough to recognize the hospitality of the native people and their brilliance. These people who shared their resources, their food, their culture, their crafts, their amazing way of life, and their customs freely with these men. Instead, Columbus immediately set out to capture them, put them in cages, and he tried to send them back first to Spain as slaves. But he couldn't do it because they died, most of them, or committed suicide. It's largely because of Las Casas, his very explicit writings, and his talks about what he saw, that these people, as well as the King of England, as well as the Pope himself, began to change the way they saw native people. Prior to that, they didn't think that they were people, that they had the same rights. They thought they were like apes, and they didn't think apes or monkeys or dogs or any other animal had rights either. So who was this Las Casas person? He was nobody, like you and me. But he was persistent. He saw a truth and he tried to tell it. He wouldn't give it up, even to the point of being obnoxious, threatened, rejected by all of those around him, his superiors, his family, his community. We need more ordinary people like him today. The American soul yearns for justice, for equality, for freedom. And if we are to manifest this dream, we have to be a stand, a voice for what is right, not who is right. For the first time in the history of the world, we have the knowledge and the resources to feed, clothe, and shelter every single human being on this planet. But do we have the will? Do we have the vision? Can we make the shift from us and them to I and thou? From it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, get them before they get you, to all one human family, stronger together, inextricably linked. Charles Fillmore in Atom Smashing Power of Mind says, and this is 140 years ago, people everywhere on earth are now realizing as never before that the well-being of the world rests with its inhabitants. It's no longer religious dogma or philosophical theories about destiny of the race. He said, God has given all things to us, we know it, to use and to determine how to use. The real object of life, both the Fillmores said, is not making money, becoming famous, or building tall and unique buildings or fancier, faster cars, but the building of character, the building of consciousness, the bringing forth of the potentialities that exist in every person in the unique way that only you can and nobody else can. Our inner transformation, our union with God, our alignment with a higher purpose, is the only power that will sustain us. God is speaking to us in the people, in the places, in the events, and in the problems of our times. We've all chosen to be here for a reason. How shall we be? I have a few suggestions. Values. Have some. Think about them and live them. Spend time in nature. Contemplate your truth deeply and develop the fine art of conversation, especially with people you don't know. We have a great opportunity this Friday. We need translators. We're going to be in the room with people we have never met, at least 30 or 40 of them, I think now. They're selling all the tickets we gave them, and they're from all kinds of places we've never been. Deeply listen and speak your truth. Remember and know America and Americans are beautiful. Thank you.